Hello everyone. Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Dhiman Bhattacharya. I'm Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature, Center for Comparative Literature, Bhasha Bhavan Vishwabharati. The author of this module is Dr. Swagata Bhattacharya. This particular course deals with Canadian literature and this module deals with diaspora literature. The learning objectives of this particular modules are: what do we understand by diaspora? What do we understand by diaspora poetry in Canada? Identify the major writers who belong to the diasporas, and then a comparative study of the various diaspora in Canada. Diaspora, meaning and origin. The first mention of the word diaspora can be traced to the Septuagint in the translation of the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament into Koine Greek, 3rd to 2nd century BC. The Septuagint contained a phrase "es diaspora en passe basile te je," which translates into English as, I quote, "Thou shalt be a dispersion in all kingdoms of the earth." The use of the word began to develop from this original sense. The word diaspora is derived from joining the Greek word dia and the infinitive speirein to mean to spread, to scatter, or to disperse. The etymological meaning of the word makes it a term to describe scattered and or dispersed people across the globe. Until the early 1960s, diaspora as a term remained confined to the Judeo-Christian traditions. In 1966, for the first time, the concept of African diaspora was introduced to the world by George Shepperson in his classic article, The African Abroad. For the first time, the concept of African diaspora was introduced to the world by George Shepperson in his classic article, The African Abroad, or the African Diaspora. The popularization of the term within African studies led to its boosted usage in various disciplines of the humanities. Since the 1980s, scholars in disciplines such as anthropology, linguistics, and of course literature use the term to relate to expatriate ethnic or cultural or religious groups and communities. Canada, commonly known as a land of immigrants, is home to a large number of diasporas spread across the nation. By a diaspora, what is now generally referred to is a group of people having a common point of origin and sharing a common dream of returning into that original homeland. The Indo-Caribbean, the South Asian diaspora, the Chinese and Japanese diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora and the African diaspora are among the major diasporas prevalent in the socio-political cultural scenario of Canada. When slavery was abolished in 1833, the British plantations in Guyana and Trinidad urgently needed labor to meet the severe shortage of workers. India offered itself as an obvious major alternative source of labor in areas where land was scarce, such as the Caribbean islands. Newly freed slaves were forced back to work on the plantations. In areas where land was plentiful such as Guyana, Suriname and Trinidad, former slaves took up independent subsistence farming. The need for plantation workers was supplied in part by the system of indented labor. Natives of India agreed to work for a fixed number of years in one of the former colonies in exchange for a meagre wage and lodging. Indian labor immigration to Guyana took place in 1838 and to Trinidad in 1845. Most laborers came from the northern and eastern parts of India, though a sizable minority came from the Tamil and Telugu speaking regions of the south. They were mostly Hindus, but there were very few Muslims also. In the 1940s, laborers from India started coming to Guyana in South America and to Mauritius off the coast of Africa. In the 1960s, to the British colony of Natal in South Africa. In the 1870s, to the Dutch colony of Suriname, and in the 1880s to Fiji. The indenture system was finally abolished in 1917, though immigration to colonial areas continued even after that. Even today, the people of India constitute more than 40% of the population in Guyana and Trinidad. Initially, missionary activities were met with resistance from the East Indians who desired to retain their culture and ethnic identity. What is diaspora? A common practice as far as the reception of Canadian literature is concerned. Are people actually aware of the historical event called the diaspora? This particular module will actually focus on the various traits of the reception of this diaspora within the Canadian literary consciousness. The idea of the word diaspora can be traced back into history into several important or rather seminal texts in history. But talking about the current usage of the diasporas present in Canada, that is the Indian diaspora, the Chinese diaspora, the Japanese diaspora and others, the important concept that comes to our mind is the anxiety of returning to one's own land of origin. This particular module will actually explain that idea with the recurrent motive as encountered in the poets of the diaspora origin. We begin with the first poet, Rama by Spinet. Rama by Spinet, 1948. Rama by Spinet was born in 1948. The Indo-Caribbean Canadian poet, novelist, essayist, and critic Rama by Spinet was born in San Fernando, Trinidad and Tobago. She came to Canada to study at New York University and got her doctoral degree from the University of West Indies, Trinidad and Tobago. At present, she teaches English at Seneca College. Her first book of poems, Nuclear Seasons, 1991, established her as a poet of eminence. Princess of Spadina, 1992, Nina's Carnival, 1993 are among her other books of poetry. Her debut novel, The Swinging Bridge, 2003, is a landmark in her literary career. Jose Knight. Rama by Spinet's poems may be analyzed best under the heading of cultural memory. Since in her works no memory is individual, she speaks of a vast collective memory related to and rooted in cultures both Indian and Creole. The history of migration of indentured labor and the subsequent double migration led to a sense of double displacement and confusion among poets like Spinet. The political need to invent and identify forms the basis of her poem. Jose Knight, physically present in Canada the protagonist of the poem unlocks the rusty iron lock of memory to witness Muharram in the streets of Port of Spain. Jose, coming from Hussein, Prophet Muhammad's grandson, was a night festival in Trinidad. It was an occasion for celebration by a mixed population, but the memories of celebration are interwoven with other kinds of memory, the ones which are like the cutting edge of bitter cane. Those moments are the ones related to the reality of poverty, suffering, and exploitation of the ancestors. The poet sometimes becomes a small girl, sometimes a small boy, wandering along the streets of Trinidad, watching the taja, the lights, the sounds, and the drums. This is the poet's journey of memory. Once it's over, she returns from her psychic space to the physical one. Her sense of hometown or homelessness and the painful process of adapting to a new homeland is manifested in every line. We lived alone. This land is home to me, now homeless, a true refugee. As this particular module is dealing with the idea of diaspora, it is very interesting to understand the diaspora of the Caribbean. And the poet whom we are discussing in this module, Rama by Spinet, happens to capture this historicism in her lines. It is very interesting to note the idea of double displacement and probably double diaspora in case of Rama by Spinet. With the abolishment of the slavery or slave traditions, Trinidad and the other cultivation zones needed laborers. India became a normal supplier, a normal choice rather, of supplying laborers to this region. What happened then? People from the northern part of India migrated to these new homelands to work as laborers. Canada, after a point of time, brought people from these Caribbean islands, hence creating this double displacement for this group of people for whom the idea of home was already doubly displaced. Ramabai's idea of displacement, a longing for a home in an adopted homeland, is reflected in every line that we encounter. A nowhere place. Ramabai Spinet's A Nowhere Place echoes the same deep-rooted feeling of non-belongingness. She deliberately uses the word refugee to drive home the enormity of the cultural disposition of the Indo-Caribbeans. They are strangers everywhere, victims of misplacement, of displacement. They are neither Caribbean nor Indian. The displaced people suffered due to their stubborn inclination to retain their ethnic cultural identity. Thus, what could have been their advantage worked against them, and they could never become Caribbean. They lived apart, remained politically inactive, and uninvolved in the mainstream of the Afro-Caribbean struggle. Thus, generally, whenever Caribbean culture is discussed or imaged, the Indo-Caribbean community finds a nowhere place. They are akin to thieves. They are declared shameless. They are the usurpers of land. They have always been charged with these allegations without anyone realizing that they actually have no land of their own, that they actually belong nowhere. South Asian diaspora. The earliest South Asian immigrants to Canada were railway workers and lumbermen who were packed off in large numbers from India and the China in the 1800s because white laborers refused to be employed in those perilous and meagerly paid jobs, such as railway constructions. Since then, South Asian immigrants have always been in demand in the Canadian labour market. Most South Asians in Canada trace their lineage back to India. Approximately around the period between 1905 and 1908, some 5,000 South Asians arrived in British Columbia. They were obviously lured by economic prospects. Throughout the early 1900s, a set of deliberate restrictive laws prohibited much South Asian immigration. However, by the 1960s and 1970s, restrictions were gradually loosened and immigration legislation in 1962 and 1967 substantially liberalized South Asian migration in Canada. Before 1962, most immigrants from South Asia were men from Punjab. After 1962, the influx was more balanced between men and women. Besides Sikhs from Punjab, educated Hindus from Gujarat, Bombay and Delhi came to Canada, as well as Muslims from Pakistan and Bangladesh and Buddhists from Sri Lanka. As we have already discussed the Caribbean diaspora in Canada, we now move forward towards the South Asian diaspora and their cultural productions. Who were the South Asian people who were migrating to Canada and in which point in history? To understand this, we always have to relate it with the idea of the indentured laborers that we have encountered in the case of the Caribbean diaspora. Most of the South Asian diaspora immigrated to Canada as workers who would work in the construction of railways, as white labor force in Canada refused to do such perilous works. So what happened? Many people from India and the South Asian region migrated to Canada as labor force. One really needs to understand that the influx of the South Asian diaspora actually brought people from this region, to be more specific, from the various countries of this region. We begin with Krishantha Sri Bhagiyadatta. He is a Canadian poet of Sri Lankan origin who lives in Toronto. His publications include Domestic Bliss, 1982, The Only Minority in the Bourgeoisie, 1985, and The 52nd State of Amnesia, 1992. He writes for the Toronto South Asian Review. Krishantha Sri Bhagiyadatta's Winter 84 is an ironical poem which paints a picture of stark reality faced by immigrants in multicultural Canada. The poem is in the form of a conversation between a white Canadian store owner and a colored immigrant client. It has the typical suspense peculiar to Bhagiyadatta's poems. When the client tries to strike a casual conversation with the store owner by saying that the weather is too cold, he gets the reply that it is not what it used to be. This simple remark makes the client feel nervous. He starts thinking that any moment he might be accused of bringing about this undesirable change in weather. After the passage of a few anxious moments, the store owner replies that since America has sent a man to the moon, the weather has changed. Like a typical old man, the shopkeeper detested human interference in the course of nature. His innocent reply released all tension and anxiety, and his client left the store feeling hugely relieved. It might be said that this man was thinking too negatively. However, the poem is an indication of what colored immigrants have to go through in their daily lives, where they are accused for anything and everything that occurs in the land they have migrated to. Immigrants get used to being blamed so much that it is not an exaggeration for them to think that they might even be accused for a change in weather. The poem is from the point of view of a colored immigrant who has become used to finding himself in a no man's land everywhere. In the Valley of the Towers. In the poem, In the Valley of the Towers, the valley refers to the urban landscape of Toronto, surrounded on all sides by pillars of prosperity and richness. It is a place where an immigrant finds himself surrounded by bangs, noises, and rustle of a busy city life. It is a place full of tourists, full of liveliness and joy. In the backdrop of a beautiful scenery, one can see Latin music being played by a Cuban band, women singing songs from all over the world. The sights and sounds of Toronto are intended to show people that it is a multicultural place where people from all parts of the world move around happily. One building arrests the poet's attention. It is the Strathcona Hotel. The Strathcona Hotel is that notorious place in the heart of Toronto where migrants are confined before deportation and where several of them had killed themselves. Amidst such life and gaiety, the immigrant poet finds it difficult not to remember the darkness and gloominess of the Strathcona Hotel, which Canadians seem to overlook in their daily activities. It reminds the poet that no matter how much an immigrant takes part in the daily activities of Toronto, any day he or she might find himself or herself inside the dreaded place. Before we move on to the other diasporas, we have already talked about the Caribbean diaspora and the Indian diaspora, the presence rather of this diaspora within the cultural milieu of Canada. It is very interesting to note that when we are discussing or dealing with the poems of Bhagavata, what we immediately encounter is the cityscape. Most of these people, this educated middle class who have migrated to this new land, lives in Toronto or Vancouver. The city as it appears to them is a city of fulfillment, of desires that could be achieved or that could be negotiated. The moment these people are out on the main streets of Toronto, they feel that they are visibly others. The fears and anxiety of cohabiting this space makes them nervous, especially the idea of being nervous amidst the gaiety of the city life is what we encounter in Bhagavata's poem, to be more specific, that we encounter in most of the South Asian diaspora literary productions. Now we move on to the Japanese diaspora. The Japanese diaspora. Since the 1800s, Chinese and Japanese workers had been employed in the construction of Canadian Pacific Railway. With the increasing number of Asians in the country, the Canadian government felt that their white supremacy was being threatened. Anti-Asian riots started against the unwanted Asian ethnic groups, which included Indians, Chinese, as well as the Japanese in 1908. An immigration order was passed by which Asians could land in Canada only by continuous journey, and the only means of transport that allowed continuous journey was the Canadian Pacific Railway. It was forbidden to sell tickets to Asians. On top of that, the Immigration Act of 1910 imposed the law that every Asian had to possess $200 as head tax in order to enter Canada. Despite such stringent measures, the Indian, the Chinese and the Japanese migration to Canada continued. The total blow to the Japanese Canadians came much later in 1941. The Pearl Harbor bombing in December 1941 officially made Japan an enemy of Canada. The Canadian public as such had failed to differentiate between South Asians and the Japanese. Post the Pearl Harbor incident, animosity towards the Japanese became so deep in British Columbia that they were driven out of the place, which automatically took away their living and pushed to Nathan in Alberta. As the Japanese lived off the sea, their shift to the prairies destroyed their normal rhythm of life. This incident bore such a deep scar that most Japanese Canadians failed to get out of this trauma. A Sanzi or third generation Japanese Canadian, Roy Miki, born in 1942, was born in Winnipeg a few months after his family was forced to evacuate their homes in Haney, British Columbia. The incident disturbed him as a child and got him politically interested from a very young age. Miki became the spokesperson for the Japanese Canadian redress movement. Educated in universities such as the University of Manitoba and the Simon Fraser University, he earned his doctoral degree from the University of British Columbia. Miki is a professor of English at the University of British Columbia and the founder editor of the well-known literary journal Line, recently renamed as West Coast Line. He is also the editor of Pacific Windows Collected Poems of Hioki Keuka, 1997. Miki has been the chair of the Racial Minority Writers Committee in Canada and has coordinated Writing Through Race, a conference for First Nations writers and writers of color, 1994. Make it new. In the poem Make It New, the poet urges to create a new world where everyone finds a comfortable space for himself or herself. The poem gives precise attention to language and formal elements and addresses the need to reconceptualize space. This space includes both the formal space of a poem and the actual space in the literal meaning of the term. It is this space in which the poet questions the inherited notions of power, authority, and of survival for the marginalized. In this age, already the followers have perished, the branches have truncated, and the majestic eagles have all disappeared. Centuries of oppression and discrimination have resulted in this pitiable state. This is not the age of natural beauty. This is the age of statistics, documents, and daily headlines that speak of violence and destruction. Keuka. Roy Kenzie Keuka, 1926 to 1994, was a Nisei or second generation Japanese Canadian. He was born in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and raised in Alberta. His father was a samurai who had migrated to Canada. After 1942, the family was uprooted and Keuka could never complete his formal education. However, he grew up to a renowned painter, poet, photographer, and multimedia artist. The poem is dedicated to Fred Woo, a fellow Chinese Canadian poet. In this poem, too, the poet experiments with the form and structure and in turn creates a peculiar rhythm. This has been deliberately done to distinguish the poem of a marginalized poet from that of the mainstream. The poem is not directly about Roy Keuka, the poet. It is more about what colored minorities feel and go through in Canada. As we have already discussed, the Japanese diaspora in the literary milieu of Canada, it is very interesting to note, as we have already discussed, that the historicism of the land from which they had migrated to this new homeland has always contributed in the reception of these people. The Japanese people, who were definitely linguistic as well as visual minorities in Canada, had a difficult time to adapt in this new homeland. But the political situation in Canada, especially the Pearl Harbor bombing, contributed to the idea of building a major suspicion around Japanese people. This suspicion around Japanese people definitely structured the feelings of several other peoples towards the Japanese people in Canada. These are some of the recurring motifs also that we find in Keuka. Now we move on to Frederick James Woo. Frederick was a Chinese diaspora. Frederick James Woo is a Chinese-Canadian poet, novelist and scholar born in Saskatchewan. He was raised in British Columbia by a Chinese father and a Swedish-Canadian mother. His mixed heritage has often come up as a theme in many of his creative works. Woo studied literature and music at the University of British Columbia, where he was the founder editor of Tish, a poetry newsletter started by the students of the University of British Columbia in 1961. Among his works, Lerdo 1965, Waiting for Saskatchewan 1985 and Diamond Grilled 1996 are the most famous. Fred Woo's Race to Go is a protest against racism faced by the colored minorities of Canada. In his anti-racial poem, the poet vehemently protests the way colored immigrants are harassed on the basis of their physical features. Certain characteristic traits are pointed out and the visible minorities are made fun of on the basis of them. For example, in this poem, the poet points out how the curry becomes a matter of joke and persecution for the visible minorities. The slanting eyes of the Chinese are made fun of along with their food habits such as taking hot rice or the practice of eating with their fingers. Coming to the Japanese diaspora and then definitely going to the Chinese diaspora creates an understanding about the reception of these people within Canada. So it is quite obvious that the cultural productions will reflect this anxiety of whether they will be accepted or not, which is another most important motif, rather recurrent motif in the literary milieu of Canada, that is of identity. Where do I belong to? We now move on to another important contributor as far as the Caribbean diaspora is concerned, and the author and the poet is Dionne Brand, born in 1953. Dionne Brand, 1953, is a Canadian poet, novelist, essayist and documentary maker of Caribbean origin. She was born in Reine-Guare, Trinidad and Tobago. At the age of 17, Brand migrated to Canada to study at the University of Toronto. Apart from being an academician, Brand labels herself as a black, lesbian, anti-racist feminist. A prolific poet, her works include No Language is Neutral 1990, Chronicles of the Hostile Sun 1984, Thirsty 2002, Inventory 2006, etc. In Another Place, Not Here 1996 and What We All Long For 2005 are her famous novels. She has also co-authored Rivers Have Sources, Trees Have Roots 1986 with Krishanta Sri Bhagavata. Stateless. Dionne Brand's Stateless is a small poem of 8 lines clearly stating the position of a colored immigrant in multicultural Canada. The poet declares that she has a definite idea about the place of her birth. The Caribbean islands, she even goes to the extent of stating the exact location of her birthplace, 15 degrees above the equator. On top of that, she has a Canadian passport and has lived all her adult life in Canada. Still, she considers herself stateless. This is because despite being considered a Canadian citizen on paper, the poet is unable to accept herself as a Canadian citizen. Her daily life in Canada and the treatment she receives there refrains her from considering herself a Canadian. It is needless to mention here that it is not just the poet's personal prejudices that have created hindrances on her path of becoming a citizen of Canada. It is Canada herself and the Canadians who have made her feel that it is not part of her immigrant's life. It is the fact that once they leave their place of birth, they lose the right to return, however. If they fail to make their adopted homeland their own, they remain stateless throughout their lives. Epigrams to Ernesto Cardinal in defense of Claudia. The poem begins by stating a line, I quote, on being told that being black is being bitter. The poem is a response to this statement, this common notion that blacks are bitter. The protagonist of poem says that she has been asked time and again about the reason of her bitterness and has also been advised to give it up in order to find the world a beautiful place. It is as if the bitterness of the blacks has made the world less beautiful. She explains that the blacks are not bitter out of their own desire. Bitterness is not something that is treasured and cherished by them. It is not an integral part of their essential blackness. Rather, it has become something which cannot be taken away from them. It is true result of being tortured, bullied, separated, repulsed and destroyed for centuries. Now it has become something inseparable from the blacks. George Eliot Clarke is a black Canadian poet born in 1960. He is also a playwright who was born in Nova Scotia. He studied at the University of Waterloo and earned his PhD in English literature from Queen's University. He teaches English at the University of Toronto and writes on black communities in and around Nova Scotia. Clarke introduced through his writings what he terms as African Indian literature. His books of poems include Saltwater Spirituals and Deeper Blues 1983, Lush Green, Blue Exiled Fugitive Poems 1994, I and I 2009. Everything is Free. George Eliot Clarke's Everything is Free is a happy-go-lucky poem in which the poet states that in the world, whatever brings happiness is free. He says that it is only those who are lonely who need money. He insists that since everyone is free, one must not try to bind one's love. He urges everybody to surrender force since force can never vanquish one's freedom. The beauty of nature, the melting sun, the refreshing scent of flowers, the rain, everything is free and equally accessible to all. He feels that since love and life are both free, one should learn to enjoy it. Through this poem, he urges his readers to celebrate freedom and respect it. Exile. Exile is thematically similar to Dionne Brand's epigrams to Ernesto Cardinal in defense of Claudia. In this poem, the poet expresses his anguish at the discrimination of being faced as a black. He finds himself treated with discrimination because of the label of the slave blood running through his veins. The history of slavery and racism has scorched the brains of all the blacks in such a manner that they cannot afford to lead a normal life. He thinks that as a member of black community, all his possessions have been framed in nostalgia. All his known faces are now the faces of the dead existing only in photographs. All the lovers of the past are now lying in the ditches, slain and dead. Their eyes, which were filled with tears, are now dry. They are now like dead leaves curled up, waiting to be lighted into a fire. It is this flame of anger which seethes beneath the souls of the blacks. These are waiting to burst out into flames. They are waiting to express themselves and make themselves be heard. So as we have seen that this particular module dealt with the idea of diaspora as reflected in the poems of several diaspora writers. We have dealt with the quote-unquote diasporas from the Caribbean, from the South Asian region, from the Chinese diaspora and the Japanese diaspora. The operative words that came again and again was the idea of belonging, the diversity of the Canadian multiculturalism and how they affected the formulation of the multicultural policy, the idea of the visible minorities in Canada and how they negotiate with the founding nations. This particular module also dealt with the location specificity associated with our understanding of diaspora.